All right, everybody. Good morning. Mike here from KAMIND. Let's get started, showing a few minutes after 10 o'clock. Welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, Why the Microsoft Security Stack Works So Well. As a reminder, we'll be having one Microsoft webinar, second Thursday, and one CMMC webinar, fourth Thursday of each month to keep you up to date on what's going on. If you have any ideas for future webinars, please let me know. Before we get rolling today, a couple of housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you can keep your microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be greatly appreciated. We know many of us are still working from home. If you have questions mid-presentation, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your question in best we can. We will be recording today's webinar, so if you're uncomfortable with this, now's your opportunity to opt out. If you'd like a recording of today's webinar, please let me know. Now, with that out of the way, let's get down to business. When your name is Microsoft and most of your revenue comes from the software as a service revenue model, security is very, very important. Microsoft spends over $1 billion a year on security research and development. Most of what they've learned over the years to protect themselves is actually passed down to their client base to help protect you and your network. So please sit back and relax, and let's hear our President and CEO, Matt Katzer, talk to us today about why the Microsoft security stack works so well. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. And this is a topic that's very dear to my heart when I look at the Microsoft security stack and how it's changed over the years. I'm on a couple Microsoft advisory committees as a partner committee, for instance. And one of the things we recommend a few years ago for like the MS 365 Business Premium was Microsoft to actually enable that and give the what we call the Defender P2 license, which is a high-end security remediation product, and just bundle that in terms of the Business Premium so the small business users have access to it. That's the type of commitment that Microsoft has, but also from KAMIND, how we're involved, how we look forward to try to figure out what is the best things to actually work for our clients. A little bit about us, and this is kind of a fun presentation, so this is going to be an interactive demo on it. And what I have is I have configured a demo site that's basically has active breaches in it. And we're actually going to walk through a couple of incidents and see how they actually work and how you can go about doing discovery in them. A little bit about KAMIND, just for those that are new for us, is we're an Inc. 5000 company, third year running, and we look forward to making the fourth year as well. We're also one of the 52 companies in the US that can actually sell the GCC licenses to the Department of Defense community, which is over 300,000 clients that we have enabled that we can actually provide those security services. And we're also do a lot of things associated with DoD. We've migrated over 100,000 users and 400 companies to 365. And also I've written a book on 365 on securing and have over 280,000 copies that are sold. A little bit about KAMIND and really about us in terms of what we do. We exist to prevent and solve big problems. And that's in essence is what we try to do. And it's all about the prevention. And we've learned many years ago that if you get the right license mix in terms of how you actually want to deploy it, you put the right security SKUs in place, you actually drive down IT service costs. And that's really critical. So what are we going to do today? And this is kind of, I want to give you kind of a brief overview of why Microsoft security and also about the Microsoft security architecture and how the security stack fits in. And then we're going to go through a spear phishing example of a compromise in a tenant. And it's quite a normal compromise. You see it. Someone clicked on a compromised URL and how this whole starts and how basically credentials get lost and leads into ransomware. And then also I'll follow up with the current status on ransomware and what's happening in the market because there's a lot of changes that are going on. And also give you some ideas of what you can actually do next. So as I said, if there's questions that come up, just put them in the chat session. Mike is our moderator and he'll basically make sure that we kind of get the pieces and everything else and try to make sure we'll roll them into the presentation. And try to really, my goal here is It's not going to be it's really to give you an understanding of the pieces and everything else and why you want integrated security and why it's so important. And to step back in time and try to look at what's going on, this is a graph we've seen Microsoft has done over and over again, known as the intelligent graph. And what it is that there's billions of trillions of information that is being collected and it's all anonymized in terms of what's happening from users, from Windows 10 systems and everything else. And this is really critical. This is critical the way Microsoft security strategy works, because as those Windows 10 systems get out there, those 100 million, 200 million systems, those things have breaches or attacks on them. That information's collected, and for organizations that have like the security SKUs, when you actually enable integration into the security stack, you actually get real-time notification. So you could have a situation where you have one workstation on the left side of you that gets breached, and the other workstation on the right side of you is remediated. That's how the intelligent security graph works. But as we look through pieces of it, you look in terms of you have to fundamentally look the way our organizations are designed and what things are happened. And that gets in the whole idea of what we call about zero trust. And really zero trust is verification, trust but verify. You verify explicitly, use least privilege access, and assume it's a breach. Because, and when I wrote the 365, Securing 365, then the FBI director said that there's two types of companies in the world, those that have been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. And so when you actually look at it, you have to assume that a breach has happened and how you actually minimize data. And especially with all the conflict going on in Europe and the cyber attacks that are taking place, it's really important to basically make sure we operate on a least privilege model and protect those digital assets, which is core to our business. And when you look in terms of the zero trust policy and how Microsoft security fits into it, it really is about the philosophy: you protect everything, you simplify the complex, you catch what others miss, and that's all about the integration of data, and you grow so you have ability to grow in the future. And when Microsoft looks at security, they just don't look at, just the Azure and the 365 environment. It really is an end-to-end. So it doesn't matter if you're turns a hybrid cloud, if you're running Google Cloud or AWS, or just the Microsoft Azure 365. And we have environments that we manage that cross all three different public clouds environments. And we integrate all those data so you have information collection. You can take and do the analysis and figure out how to actually block those threats so you can actually isolate them onto those workstations that make sense. And that's the key on security. And it's all about integration, about basically make sure you have the pieces. And as you've gone through the industry and look at what's happened with a lot of the other suppliers like Sophos, for example, and Barracuda and everything else, they're being acquired or they're acquiring other companies to build out the stack to make sure they get this end-to-end component. Because it's not just like a firewall company. It's not just the firewall. The firewall companies now have to basically put endpoint management in place. And there's philosophies, well, what type of firewalls do you need? Are software firewalls good? Well, how do you protect things? But that's a type of stuff that you actually are looking at. You're looking at trying to do the integration. And the Microsoft provides that integration for you. The little thing about in terms of changes, and if you look in the history, and Microsoft, as we look in the Windows 7 days, did not really have a very good reputation. But lately, in terms of what has happened in the past couple of years, especially when Satya came on board, he said his number one objective is to make sure that Microsoft is a leader of security. And that is what's happening. And they're basically operating to make sure they're in the Magic Quadrant, the Gartner report. And also when you look at the Forrester in terms of where they are, they're basically in the top end of all the categories. And that's really critical when you actually look at how data get integrated. Now, I just have one other kind of a marketing slide for you from a cost, so you actually kind of understand the cost structure, is that when Microsoft looks at the 365 in terms of the security model or Microsoft Security, which we call the E5 security add-on, it roughly costs about $12 per user as an add-on per month, compared to like a multi-vendor security solution. So when you look at the pieces and everything else, you're trying to figure out how to do the costs. How do you make sure you have the cost benefit and everything? So I kind of wanted to position the strategy. Now, to really understand the Microsoft security strategy, and we're going to have a couple of different webinars on it. There's something known as a Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture. And I'll have Mike go put this URL into the chat window so you can actually go look at it. But basically, how you actually look at your environment in terms of the capabilities, the people in terms of how you handle incidents and your mentality about dealing with it, how your security operations, how the operation technologies works, and how you use like Azure environments and Azure Arc and other capabilities like that. And those are basically are fundamental. So when you look at this architecture, it's all encompassing. So it's just not saying, hey, I got to run an antivirus or I run an EDR agent on a desktop. It's very wide focus in terms of how you need to grab information. And that's where the intelligent graph comes in, because you got to look at this information you collect and basically take actions on it. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to focus more on the attack chain. And that's kind of where it gives you an idea, because that gives you a really good example of how the security stack actually works. So when I actually go dive down in terms of the Microsoft security stack, I go look specifically on the infrastructure so you see kind of the pieces that we're looking at. And really, as you look at where we actually go and how the security stack works, this is how the security stack works. So when you actually put all the pieces in place, you have Azure Sentinel, you have the EDR components, you have Office 365 Defender, you have Azure Defender for Cloud, they all work with each other and they all communicate to each other. So, and the key things from as you look at the security architecture, look at the concept, it's really trying to understand what this really means. So we kind of broke it down into key concepts, and then we're going to go into, our story of our breach. And the first thing you look at is we talk about threat intelligence. Now, that earlier graph I showed about how data is collected. Data is collected in trillions and trillions of endpoints. And that's actually managed in terms of how you actually collect information. And that data, now you as users have the options to basically submit anonymized data to the threat graph. And the advantages of doing that, when you actually submit it, then you actually will get notification that changes will dynamically affect your environment and basically remediate actions. So when you look at threats and everything else, you're looking at basically trying to figure out how this happens in your environment and how you actually basically can protect your environment and just make the analysis. And it all comes down to data collection and analysis. And how do you actually basically protect yourself? And when you look at terms of trying to drive that in terms of the Microsoft security stack, be it with that you're using Azure Sentinel, for instance, you're using a Defender product, you're using Azure Defender, Azure Active Directory, Microsoft Defender for Identity, all these different pieces play together in terms of how you want to actually control information and reduce risk. And that's what it's about in businesses today, because what you're trying to do is you want to try to basically take your surface area. That is the area where hackers or external bad actors can actually come in and affect your environment. And you want to reduce that threat area. And that's really key. And when you talk about the attackers, when they talk about it, the key things that attackers do, it's all about privilege access. And when we talk about privilege access, for one of the things that KAMIND does when we actually deploy Office 365 and integrate them into Azure and basically in on-prem Active Directory environments, for instance, our global admin accounts we set up do not have an account on the on-premise environment. Just like the on-premise enterprise admin accounts do not have accounts in Office 365, because we want to put that isolation, because even though we don't have a true privilege access in that model, we're trying to reduce risk, because we're trying to address this whole thing about how to make sure things are addressed and minimize compromising. So when you look at different pieces from an attacker, for instance, if you're running even if you have like a 365 global admin account that you just use for 365 activity and you have a user account, you're still susceptible because this whole piece that you have, and this is what we call the surface area that you're available for compromise. And your goal of what you want to try to do is reduce that. And one of the key things and key technologies you take advantage of that is basically use privilege access. And privilege access, what it does is reduce the surface area, so it forces it into a very limited area that you can actually compromise your network. And that's really critical, so that even with us at KAMIND, the way we operate our environment is that we have separate environments for our client tenants. We have separate environments for our production. So we basically have vapor walls between them. And we structure using privilege access components to protect information, because information is critical to our business today. And that's really the secret as you look the pieces as we go through our demo. Now, the whole thing that you want to try to actually look at of what happens when an endpoint's compromised, and this is the whole basis of theory that you look at. And this is where our example that we're going to go run today is that when you actually have a user that doesn't insert a USB or clicks on a phishing attachment, that basically payload is actually executed. And you have to put the necessary pieces in place, like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, that can actually go through and remediate the payload and restrict the damage in the organization. So in essence, it's also basically, and once it does that, since you're actually part of the Microsoft security graph, you actually push that information out to not just your environment, to other environments as well. So we all operate as a community. And that's really critical when you look at solutions today. You no longer can actually be a point organization. You have to look at how you can grow the organization and look at how you want to share information in such a way that's secure. And that's how this whole threat intelligence plays in place. And then when you actually drill down and look at what happens, let's take a look at that system that was compromised. You actually go through and how the endpoint looks at it. It basically does a threat detection level. And we're going to go walk through this in a little bit more detail. And then it basically goes through and figure, okay, how do we actually restrict access to other resources to make sure those resources aren't compromised? And that's what the secret of it when you do any type of threat analysis and threat detection. So, and that's really the whole basis of what we call the defense across a kill chain. And so you have the Defender for 365 trying to address the email. You have the endpoint piece of it. You have the Azure identity information in terms of protection of the identity. You have looking at in terms of compromise, in terms of attacker, that's basically using a Kerberos keys or be able to walk or do what we call lateral movement. And then you also try to look at trying to block data exfiltration. And overall, you have Azure Sentinel, the SIEM that basically sits there to basically try to make sure and kind of manage it from a behavioral standpoint. So let's go look at our closer attack look chain. And that's what give you some ideas, and we'll make sure there's some times open for questions. And protection, like I said, across the chain, when you look at it, you really comes across a couple of things in our example. You have a phishing email that comes in, something gets compromised, you have command control like a minicast or something like that that will get executed. The attacker tries to breach in terms of the compromise of credentials, and then basically exfiltrate data. And that's kind of what happened, and they sell that. And that's kind of the information. So what we have is a storyboard. And on a storyboard, we have a situation where we have an attacker, and basically they send a phishing email into a client, and this client, Carla, actually clicked on it. And we're going to walk through the analysis and the different pieces of data, what's happening. So let's go through and follow the kill chain real quick. So I'm going to move my screen over here, and hopefully everyone, so I think everyone should be able to see this right now. So, and when you actually look at incidents, this is known as securitycenter.microsoft.com. And so you have this in all your 365 tenant. And if you have the security SKUs enabled, you have access to that. One thing that people look at is saying, well, you have all these incidents. Now, this particular tenant is a active tenant that's actually going under attacks real time. and we can use it in simulations to see what's going on. One of the things that you do when you see information, you can control information. And what we've done is we actually looked at all the services sources of the Defender for Identity, Cloud Apps, Endpoint Defender, and all. So we turn all those on so we see all the alerts in one place. So what's happened, and I'm looking on the left-hand side, the screen is on my left. So what's happened is that we have these incidents that go through. And when we look at what's happened, we can actually take this one like the 365, this demo multi-stage demo incident, and we can expand this situation, and we find out that a suspicious URL was clicked. And what happens in these things, we actually can get a timeline and a chain of event that actually walks through. So we can go through and say, okay, let's go see what exactly happened. And you can actually go walk through the event and say that, okay, and basically the user clicked on a URL at 10:14:59, they received it. Then basically the remote debugging port was opened up, and you can actually go through and see the characteristics and drill down. And what's really interesting when you actually look at this environment, you can actually go through and drill down the detail associated with it. And you can actually look in terms of the various pieces. Now, what happens on this, you start figuring out like, okay, where's this actually happening? Well, you see this piece over here. We have the organization. We have 4 entities in this organization that are being attacked, but worldwide, there's roughly about 10,000. So you have an active type environment that's going through. Now, the threat in terms of the incident alerts that we actually have that we see are kind of fascinating because we can actually go down and look at different characteristics. And you can go through and say that, okay, let's look at what happens like in this specific case where they basically in this environment, in this demo, they run minicast and they came through and they executed the environment. And then they're basically going through and building out a script. So you as a security operations person can actually go through and say what's really happened. Now the pieces on what's nice about Defender for Endpoint will actually catch this and remediate all this. So when we actually look at the alerts and everything else that are generated from this, we actually can go through and we can actually, as we go through and looks at the incident and the alerts, we can actually see what's being remediated and resolved. And that's what happens here. Like in this one right here, here's an active process. And also we see different type of information that are going through so we can actually go deal with it. So, you know, you look at how stuff is being collected and everything else, and then you have from an organization, you can figure out, okay, what is the things I need to do to go address this? So as one of the pieces, for instance, as I look through alerts, for instance, I'm actually going to go drill down into like, let's go look at there's one in here that's really, this is a click on a suspicious URL. And you can see different types of, different types of situations that happen. So potential malicious URL was clicked. So when you actually go and drill down into the environment, you can actually come through and say, okay, now what really happened to this user? Go click on it and examine what's the user actually did, why it really happens, what happens. You notice like right here, you have DMARC and DKIM was valid, went through. And also this area called campaign ID, which is really interesting when you look at from a cybersecurity. If you have an active aggression going against a couple of clients and you see it going against other clients as well, these are called campaigns. So you actually will see that. And then what in this case we want to do is we want to go look at the email detail and do an analysis of what's going on in the email and say what type of remediation do we have. And then we can actually go through and look in terms of what's happened. Well, it was delivered in their inbox and it was detected and basically and the user clicked on it. And they look in terms of the analysis on it, we can actually go through and look at the header. And for those that actually know, there's a header analyzer that you can actually use. We can launch the header analyzer and copy the header into it. and actually look at the detailed information, which is useful to figure out, okay, what exactly happened? Were they using something like an NDR scatter backfill? What that is for information is that, and you've seen it, you receive emails that are sent to a address that doesn't exist or someone else, and you're put on the copy chain. So when you're actually your mail system going through, it detects that the email is valid and automatically allows the CCs in there. In the Microsoft security stack, we have a way to actually turn that off. So you can actually stop the NDR backscatter if that's an issue. So there's different configurations that you can actually do. Now, the other interesting aspect is from a cybersecurity analyst standpoint, is you want to look for other emails that are coming through that are consistent on this. Now, that's just some of the pieces that you actually have. Now, when I actually look at incidents, for instance, and incidents gives you an idea, and this is why all the stack comes in. When I actually go through and say, I want to go look at a detailed incident, you see the MITRE attack alerts that are being put in place. So now you actually see the timeline that happened, like this one happened at 8:26 and this happened at 8:51, and how it actually walks through and the owners took through. So as you go through in this case, it's a phishing email that happened, minicast was actually executed, and you actually end up in a situation where you compromise the credentials and you're looking for that on-premise ADE passwords. And then you can actually drill down in terms of, let's go look at the details associated with this. And then also from a standpoint, what are the recommendations that we actually need to go through fix so that we can actually look at different situations, and we can actually see the real-time timeline, which I find is very interesting as you look in terms of, because you really get an idea of what goes on and how the attack link works. So you see not only the messages come through on here in terms of the timeline, but you can actually go through and say, okay, what exactly happened? Well, you have an issue that you either clicked on something, and then you have PowerShell was actually executed. So one of the questions comes up as an organization, do you allow PowerShell to remote execute it on your Windows 10 boxes, or have you configured that capability out with Intune, for instance? And you start looking at how you want to manage your organization. That's what security is all about today. And so when you look at the kill chain and the pieces, this is really, and you get into in terms of trying to understand what goes on, you can actually do the necessary deep dive and then figure the pieces and what's actually going on that individual system. Now, the other thing that we actually have is that when you look at it, that overriding bubble that we have to kind of manage it, we have different types of ways to look at it. One is Azure Sentinel. Now here's Azure Sentinel, a SIEM that's configured for the environment. And right now we can actually look at different incidents that actually happen. We can actually go through and look at the incidents in detail and figure out how they are. Now, Azure Sentinel, when you look at it, it's a combination of you're looking at behavioral analytics and also looking at deeper type queries that you can actually go through and look at the alerts and figure out, okay, what are the entities that are actually affected in terms of the VH and what type of discovery and what type of things that you need to go address. And this is what you actually have to look at or what you do. You also have workbooks that you can actually use to go through analysis of data. And this one is that, for instance, you look at the 365 workbook let me just get one for here. Like we'll do with Exchange workbooks, for instance, so we can actually go view the saved workbook and see what the analysis of data is. And it looks like we don't have any data on here. And it's we have to look at some of the parameters. But that gives you an idea what you can actually pull data and information about it and how it actually works. So all this information that you actually have in terms of how the environment's actually configured, what type of events are, this is all about trying to collect information and reduce the amount of data that you actually have. Like this environment in 24 hours, this is 2.9 million events. So what you have to do when you look at data, and especially in terms of security analytics, you have to reduce it down to what's important. And for instance, like, we have our guard security program. We've been doing this for a number of years. We actually have methodologies we go through to reduce down to what events are really important, are tailored for organizations. But let's go back in terms of the looking at the workstation and everything else. So when you look at basically the whole environment, be it of alerts and be it terms of what type of alerts are actually happening, lateral movement is one that you're very much worried about, because if you wanted to ransomware, this is typically what happens, because that's and how you actually prevent it and how you actually drive yourself to basically make sure this situations doesn't happen. So that gives you an idea of basically what's available in the stack. And the key thing is it's really, really you basically do initial configuration, you build out the security SKUs, you add them into the environment, and the environment's enabled. You put the defender, and the way the Microsoft strategy works is that when you look at pieces, Azure Sentinel is kind of like an overall environment that kind of monitors and gives you a single pane of glass. But what happens is the remediation, there's automatic remediation that actually happens on the desktop in the clients that are being addressed. So you basically minimize the threats. And that's what you're actually seeing here. So when you see the threats, like going through these millions of events that happen, you see that these threats are resolved. And that's really critical, is that you want to make sure that these threats are basically resolved and addressed. And you also want to make sure that you, in essence, you see the ability to actually integrate to the Microsoft security threat team if you need to. So that kind of gives you the pieces in the walkthrough. Now, looking at the kill chain and everything else, I just have some summary slides here. It really is about how you actually manage the incidents in terms of how you actually put in the characteristics you put in it. And also when you look at your organization, you have to look at it from a standpoint of basically trying to figure out what's the sequence of events. Like in this case down here, the suspicious URL was clicked, and you can actually go through and see the different levels at what really happens, because what the bad actors are doing, they're trying to actually get a domain credential. Now go back to the zero trust diagram I showed you early. So the question you all ask yourself is, are your global admin accounts set up on PIM, privileged identity management? So that basically you have to actually do a multi-factor authentication to become a global admin. You have to go through and basically re-authenticate yourself, and it's only valid for a certain time period. And how are you set up in that environment to reduce risk? And that's the key to basically the whole, and especially today, because, get back to what happened in terms of the FBI director from a few years ago. There's two companies in the world, those that have been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. And so the whole thing is you have to assume a zero trust. You trust and verify and assume that you've been breached. And you have to pay attention in terms of these multi-stage attacks that are happened. And that's the secret of the Microsoft stack and the security stack, because it really goes through and protects the kill chain. Now, that gives you an idea piece. I have one other thing that I wanted to, just kind of mention to you. It's kind of how ransomware has evolved and how it's changed. And it's going through other changes as well. And basically, originally ransomware, it's a business model, and it was very opportunistic, going after single devices in terms of environments. And what's happened is that ransomware kind of involved, especially when the PETA time and the WannaCrypt time has come out, because you started getting to what we call the human operated ransomware, which is targeting enterprise organizations. And so what happened is that you now have, instead of just broadcasting ransomware out there and try to hope someone clicks on a URL, you have very specific attacks going against organizations. So in terms of, like, for instance, when you do a 365 account and you actually have your password in Office 365, when you enter your password goes through a dark web scan. So if your password is already out in the dark web and compromised, they're not going to allow you that password in 365. Those are the things that you have to do along with MFA. But it's really important, because when passwords are in the dark web, they are sold. And those sold are basically are used in human operated ransomware. And so people come through and they start targeting. And you heard a lot about Facebook in terms of Twitters, in terms of accounts being shut down from that were running by bad actors, which were basically organizations set up to collect information about potential targets. And when you actually look in terms of organization, if you're in terms of what your job role, what you're trying to do is someone's actually trying to craft an organization, craft basically an attack against you based on your business role. And you have to repair, you have to look about everything, you have to worry about that. And that's really what's happening in terms of human operated ransomware. And it's basically going after targeted theft in organizations. And that's like really critical to look at in terms of how you actually have to look at what you need to defend yourself and how you actually put the necessary tools in place. So if you haven't done pulling MFA, haven't putting the advanced security tools and security pieces in the stack, you need to do this because this is how you protect your business. And that's what it's about today, because the business value of an organization are their digital assets. And you as a kind of stewards for your organizations and members, you have to protect your digital assets in your organization, because that's basically, and it's not just for your own company assets, but your vendors that you do business with, because you have a responsibility to basically make sure that information is protected. And it's basically, it's not just your information, it's everyone. So in the past, people say, oh, I don't have that much information. You have a lot, because what happens is that when you look at human operated ransomware, they're actually using information, relationships with you to go after larger organizations. And you don't want to, especially in the days of now with the cyber liability and the insurance liability, you don't want to have a situation that you did not do something, that you actually ran into a situation where you basically created an environment where you compromised one of your vendors or one of your clients. And that's why way this whole thing work in terms of human operated ransomware. Find out what's going on in the organization, do the credential theft, go build out and go attack the other, and go execute and attack the other organization. And that's kind of key as you look into this pieces. So if the one takeaway you have from here is you need to really pay attention to what's going on. And if you don't, maybe you don't like Microsoft security stack, we think it's the best, but go put the necessary pieces in place, and you're going to have to actually make sure they're all integrated, because it's really critical to basically protect the assets. So next steps that you have to do. Well, I have one slide in here that I wanted to give you an idea of the way we look at security. And this is kind of interesting because our philosophy was like this for a number of years. And when the DoD came out with the cybersecurity maturity model certification specification, cybersecurity was like, people always put security as something they had to buy extra. Now, what happens is with the stuff that's going on in the federal government, the new federal regulations, the executive orders that came out in terms of cybersecurity, and if you guys haven't, if the organization, your organization haven't gone through your new cyber insurance requirements, you're going to find that you have to put a lot of fundamental pieces in place. And a lot of the pieces are going to be based on a lot of the DoD standards. And you're going to have fundamental, make sure MFA is put in place, make sure passwords and controls are put in place, make sure you watch in terms of vendors that you have to use. You have to build a secure environment. And that's fundamental how the environment is shaped. Now at KAMIND, we offer 3 different services for, depending if you're on our Shield program, Guard, or Fortress, that gives you different levels of security that we actually have that deployed around the security suite. And it's all about trying to reduce risk profiles. And when you talk about reducing risk profiles, you're talking about protecting your digital assets, ensuring that your business can continue to operate. And you also want to make sure that you're basically, when you actually have clients, you don't want to have a situation where you're breached and create something where your clients question your ability or trust you to actually do it. Now, some of the upcoming webinars that we have a webinars the second and the fourth Thursday every month. So next one is on May 12th is how to actually monitor your Azure spending. And there's a lot of associated which data you keep and how do you actually manage it. So we're going to walk through that. And we're also going to have, for those on our defense and industrial contractors, or even the commercial accounts, we have a DIY kit for CMC. This is your basic cybersecurity kit. What are the policy and processes you need to put in place? What are the procedures you should have, and how should those be configured? So those are fundamental. If you use our services to help you build those security, make sure you have reduce your risk, or you use one a kit and do it yourself. The key thing is that you need to do something and take action on it. So the next thing I'll do, and I'll turn it over back to Mike to see what a question is, that if you're looking for a free security assessment, contact us. We have it. And also we do what we call a baseline security. But what you want to do on 365, you want to basically make sure you upgrade to the E5 security model and put the necessary security pieces in place to make sure you can detect and monitor and basically make sure you don't have issues. Because it's not just you're trying to protect as a company, it's those that you're doing business with as well. And it's all about reputation now.
All right, nice job today, Matt. Let's open up the phone lines in the chat, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask away. I might mention that I just got off the phone shortly before this webinar speaking with a major carrier, insurance carrier rep, and they made way too many claim payments this last 12 months. And you're going to see cybersecurity insurance requirements start to become a real issue. And, they're going to demand, levels of MFA and NIST 800 and things like that to keep yourself insured, because they just can't afford to keep paying out ransomware claims and things of that nature because people aren't protecting themselves well enough.
Yeah, and if I can add a thing from a litigation standpoint, what's the way things are going to go, and we would talk to Marcus Lemonis and some of the other thought leaders. Basically, in the next 12 to 18 months, there's going to be mandatory standards that you're going to have to do. And it's not going to be good enough to say that, hey, I've done MFA or I've done this, because if you're on the bad side of a cyber claim from one of your clients, for instance, you have to have a defensible position. So it's much better to defend saying our organization implemented such and such standard, NIST 800, blah, 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 and NIST 800 171 versus I implemented MFA, because those are the type of things that are happening. Because when you actually go through in a situation, you want to be able to defend what you're doing against a known standard, and you want to be improving against that standard. And that's how the environment's changing. And it's not good enough to say you've done something. You have to now say you've done something against a standard, and you have to show what we call the object evidence and prove that you've done it, and put in the policy and procedures that you actually have it in your standard cyber maturity baseline. And that's why one of the reasons in our security programs, we have, we publish monthly security reports in terms of what's going on and what's the implementation, and constantly look at the configuration and adjust them, because that's what the requirements are. And that's the requirements are, you have to manage it, and it's an ever-changing, it changes all the time.
So again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or ask away in the chat window. We'd love to hear what's on your mind and see if we can answer your questions for you. Looks like we got a question coming in there.
Yeah, the one thing that I would also encourage everyone to look at is, if you actually have you're running global admin on your account, to really look at doing privileged identity management, so you can actually separate that. So you run global admin when you need to, and it's basically a normal user account. Because everything you're doing is about reducing risk. And when you think about reducing risk, the best example I have for that is when you drive through a neighborhood at night, and basically you go down, if you're a bad actor, saying, okay, which house do you want to break into? Are you going to break into the house that have the lights on the front porch, the house that has the basically the protection one, or the pick your protection sign, or are you going to break in the one that basically has the lights turned off on the in the house and everything else, and the car parked in the driveway without the keys, without the doors being locked? Which one do you think the bad actor is going to take? Businesses and your cloud accounts and how you manage your business is no different. You have to do the necessary thing to basically minimize the risk. And much as we hate to say it, is that make it so it's difficult to go address in terms of attack you and have them go somewhere else. But it's basically protecting your data and your assets.
So again, everything we talked about today, we sell piecemeal, or what we really recommend is a comprehensive package of security products to really protect yourself well. And again, as Matt mentioned, we have our managed security services programs, 4 different levels, and we'd like to talk to you about that if you have interest in that.
Yeah, and to add something that you're going to see in 18 months or 24 months is when it's not just saying when you do cyber insurance, you're going to have to go prove your object evidence. You're going to have to go prove that you have continuously managed the environment. And they're going to see much more around this. It's not, everything's no longer point and click. So you're going to have to look at, do I staff this with someone internally? Do I staff it with an outside organization such as KAMIND or some other entity? But you're going to have to figure out how to actually manage cyber insurance and manage your cyber infrastructure to basically make sure threats are being addressed. And also to make sure that you change the environment to address new threats, and it changes literally hourly.
I see Steve's typing, but I'm not sure it's to the chat. Anyways, one more time, if if you've thought of any questions you'd like to ask, or chat it in the window, please feel free. We love questions and like to hear what's on your mind. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and it's the goal is with this stuff is when you actually look at solutions, you want to get the automated remediation solutions. You want to get the pieces in place so you can actually get so you actually can secure your business, because it's literally the game's changed. And especially with what's going on in overseas and everything else, and some of the other stuff that we see coming down. And we're a member of a couple of different government groups as well. So we see a lot of information in terms of risk that concerns us. And we're changing our processes almost daily to basically make sure we don't have issues because it's not only us that we have to protect, it's our clients and our customers. And just like everyone, we all have the same problem, and it's all about how we actually do the necessary pieces to get the next level.
All right, as mentioned, if you go to www.kamind.com/feedback or /feedback, we'd like to hear your comments on today's webinar and also enter you for a free raffle gift. But I don't really see any more questions or anything coming in. So I guess we'll give you back 10 minutes of your day. We appreciate your time with us today. Hope to see you on our next webinar. And you have our contact information if you need anything. Thanks again, and you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.